How we think about morality makes a big difference to how we view events such as the Hamas-Israel conflict. Partly in response to one of your comments, Reality Reviews, I think is the person's name, or part of his name anyway. He kind of challenged me on my last video that I want to build on some of the things I started in the last video. It struck me, and he pointed out quite correctly that, I had sort of alluded to a few things but didn't really say all that much that was concrete. So I'm hoping to build on that and be a little bit more concrete in some of the things I discuss in this video. I want to suggest that there is a relatively new frame of morality that seems to be seeping into our public discourse and in how we look at public events. And like a lot of things in culture, it doesn't necessarily announce itself overtly, but is rather kind of subtle and comes in through sort of indirect means, or by implication, or by alluding to different assumptions. So I want to contrast two different, what you might consider frameworks or ways of viewing morality. And by morality, I mean what is either virtuous or what is blameworthy, sort of something like that. And there's a lot more that can be said about it, but I want to keep it at that level for now. So this relatively new frame is one that I would call collective morality. I'm not sure if that's an official term or not. It's one I'm going to use. The reason I use it is it has to do with the group that one belongs to. And the way it works is it ultimately divides the entire world, or it divides the entire population into two categories: the category of the oppressed and the category of the oppressor. And basically what it says is the oppressor category is deemed guilty because it is the people in that category that bring sort of all the harms that we have in our world. There is harm in our world. There's, greed and lies and injustice and so much more. And all those things, this framing would suppose, are the result of the oppressor class. And what's interesting about this is any seemingly virtuous behavior by the oppressor class, this framework says that it's actually not virtuous, but it is still blameworthy, because the people in the oppressor class, anything we see them doing that looks virtuous is actually a cunning attempt to maintain power, or to maintain privilege in society. And I guess with this collective morality idea, the thinking is that things will be made right once, I guess, all the oppressors are either eliminated or brought low or somehow conquered, or have their power kind of hemmed in. That once that happens, then the world would be set right. We wouldn't have oppression, and that things would be more enjoyable for everyone in life, or at least for the oppressed class. Now, the oppressed class, they are deemed virtuous just because they are oppressed, because they are so it's supposed, because they are on the receiving end of the oppression, and they endure that by their very nature makes them virtuous. And again, kind of like the oppressor class, but working in the opposite direction, any reprehensible behavior that members of this class might exhibit, we're told is not actually reprehensible, but is actually virtuous, because anything that they're doing that might seem bad is actually them striving to overthrow the oppressors, or to get rid of oppression. So what look like reprehensible behavior or actions is actually their virtuous attempt to set the world right by conquering the oppressor. And again, the idea is the oppressed will one day live in peace once all the oppressors are dealt with. And then ultimately, the way this morality framework works is one does not look at an individual's behavior or actions to determine whether they are acting virtuously or in a blameworthy manner. Rather, the only question one has to ask is that person a member of an oppressed class or an oppressor class? If they are a member of the oppressed class, then by definition, that any actions they're doing are blameworthy. did I have that right? If they are of the oppressor class, anything they are doing is blameworthy. If they are of the oppressed class, then anything they are doing is inherently virtuous. And then it's just a matter of framing who is in the oppressor class and who is in the oppressed class. And there's many different categories that this could be drawn up. Traditionally, it was done by economic class. We saw that with communism, particularly in the 20th century, that those who have lots must be oppressors and those who have less must be oppressed. But that's not the only way that frame is applied. It can be, increasingly it's applied along racial lines, that this particular race is deemed to be an oppressor, therefore anything they're doing is wrong, and then this other racial group, because they're oppressed, their behavior is inherently right. We see this with discussions about white privilege on the oppressor side, I guess, that any virtuous or redeeming quality that someone on that side has, well, that's just them trying to maintain or explain away their white privilege. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we saw, like after the killing of George Floyd in, I think, 2020, we had a lot of rioters that were looting, and that was explained away that even though looting is perhaps ordinarily looked at as being, misbehavior, that it was explained away that because the people doing the looting were a member of an oppressed class, that what they were really doing was fighting oppression, they were fighting racism, so their looting was actually virtuous. So I want to talk a little bit about another sort of more traditional framing of morality, and that's what one might consider the traditional Christian morality. Now, there's a lot that we can say about this, but just to kind of keep it, reasonably succinct, I guess Christian morality does believe that there is oppression, although they typically don't use that word, that there are oppressors and oppressed, but those two categories are contained within one person. That is, Christian morality posits that each of us are both an oppressor and one who is oppressed. Now again, in Christian circles, they don't usually use the oppression word, but it actually kind of fits, that there are things that I do that harm other people, making me, I guess, an oppressor, but just as importantly, I am harmed by the actions of other people. Now again, the degree to these harms can vary, but the point is that we each perpetrate harm and we each have harm perpetrated against us. And again, the Christian morality, unlike the collective morality, says that the solution is a different solution. It's not about conquering an oppressor class exactly, but it is about aligning one's life to the person, ways, and teachings of Jesus. And that works to fix sort of both ends of the equation, if you will. So in terms of having harm befall me, Christian morality posits that when I align my life to the person, ways, and teaching of Jesus, those harms are actually reduced, that the sting of those harms is lessened and ultimately neutralized, that in perspective of what I would have in God's kingdom, the harms that I might suffer in this world begin to kind of fade away by contrast. That's not to say that Christians are never harmed, but the idea is the damage that harm does is temporary and doesn't last. And even like the ultimate harm that can befall anyone, that being death, that Christians believe that even death is conquered when one, like I said, aligns themselves with the person, the ways, and the teachings of Jesus. So it neutralizes and ultimately defeats the power of other people's harm on me. So that's how it fixes that one side of the equation. And on that side of the equation, Christians believe that Jesus has a solution to that problem, and more important, that Jesus is the solution to that problem. Now, in terms of me harming other people, Christian morality says that when I align myself This is a phrase I like. Some people will use other phrases like when you accept Christ, when you give yourself over to Christ and his ways. These are, I think, getting at the same thing. But there is something about the person, the ways, and the teachings of Jesus. And I like the idea of alignment, but people can dicker over whether that's a great metaphor or not. But there's many different metaphors one can use. But when I do align myself to Jesus, that Christians believe that God's Spirit actually dwells in us and begins to change us and begins to guide us on how we can make better decisions that are less harmful to people. And that's a work in progress, and it ultimately takes a lifetime, and it never gets perfected in this world. But over time, we do less and less harm, and when we do harm to one another, we seek forgiveness to sort of limit the extent to which that harm can fester and get worse. So there's a remedy on the harming side, the oppressor side as well. And again, that's ultimately fulfilled at the end of our lives, but it's a work in progress that Christians believe work inside them. And again, it's Jesus has the solution, and Jesus is the solution. So that's sort of a Christian framework, so that each person ultimately harms and is harmed by other people, and that crosses all races, genders, geographies, that this is a human thing, not a particular tribal thing. So how does this relate to Hamas and Israel and the conflict there? One thing I've noticed in the discourse, in people talking about this, and especially among the academics, sort of the intellectual class, if you will. This is something I noticed even at Conrad Grebel, which is meant to be a Christian, well, I call it a university college, part of the University of Waterloo, that many of the readings we did there had this sort of collective morality idea built in, and strangely, in what I would say is an uncomfortable union, still purporting to have a Christian worldview. And again, there's different degrees of that. Some instructors seem to buy into that more than others. Certain authors seem to buy into it more than others. So there was some diversity, I guess, in how far this thinking has gone in that particular university. But broadly speaking, in the academy, this is very much the thinking that goes along. We get a taste of this when we talk about things like decolonization and settlers and indigenous people. Again, in that framing, the settlers are the oppressors by definition, and indigenous people are the oppressed, and then the moral valence gets assigned to those two different categories. So under the rubric of this collective morality, when we see, and this can work either way, but I'm speaking, I guess, of the attacks of October 7th, I believe, where we saw some horrific images, or at least I did, and I think many of you have seen them, that the collective morality framework says that, well, just because you see someone doing something that looks horrific, what they're actually doing is overthrowing oppression, and that they're actually virtuous because they are oppressed. And the person that they're perpetrating the violence against, well, it looks like he's the victim. Ultimately, he's the oppressor because he belongs to this oppressor class, or a settler class, perhaps, that, the morality would run the other direction. I guess put succinctly, this collective morality idea suggests that the aim of overthrowing the oppressor is of such vital importance that it is sort of the guiding mission, I guess, of people who believe this or use this framing, that is so laudable. Fighting oppression is so important that any means necessary are acceptable to meet that aim. So the ends, according to them, very much justify, the ends very much justify the means, even when those means look horrific. Interestingly, I guess in sort of the Christian worldview, and there's one scene in particular that comes to mind from the Gospels, and this is where Jesus is in the garden with his disciples at night, and Judas has just betrayed him, and the authorities are coming to arrest Jesus and ultimately execute him. And one of Jesus' disciples, I think according to John's Gospel, it's Peter specifically, takes out his sword and begins to, I guess, attack or fight the chief priests that are coming to, or the slave or the servant of the chief priest, and cuts his ear off. And Jesus tells Peter to basically put his sword away, and says that that's not his way. This idea of fighting, this idea of having violent means to justify even a noble end. I guess Peter had a high regard for who Jesus was, and perhaps was well intended to defend him against what looked like a mortal threat, and I guess ultimately was a mortal threat, or at least to his body anyway, in the near term. But Jesus said there's a different way to do this, that certain behaviors are not justified even for the most noble ends. So how we frame our morality, I think, makes a difference. I don't know that these are the only two ways that we can look at things, but I think one is more of what we might consider a traditional way of looking at right and wrong. And where those lines come down, people can debate, when might someone use deception for, a higher good, let's say, and other people might say that you would never use deception. So there's different debates within that. But I think we need to be concerned about this collective morality view. And I'm curious what you think about it. And one thing I wanted to say again is thank you to the comment by Reality Reviews. He left a lengthy comment. I don't know that I understood all of it, but I am taking that first part to heart anyway. I realized that I didn't say as much as I could have or perhaps should have. The fact of the matter was, I don't think I had even intended to make a video, but I had this on my mind and was by a campfire and decided to shoot a quick video. But thank you. I do appreciate comments, even if they're challenging, or maybe especially if they're challenging. I do read them and take note of them. So let me know what you think in general about whether this framing of these two different ways of looking at morality, if that's helpful. Do you believe that there is a rise of this collective morality? And I'm also curious what you think, if you do believe that, as I do, and if you do believe that it's not a helpful way of looking at things, what, if anything, can we do about it? And specifically, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, I'm curious to hear what you think about it, but I'm also curious, especially for those of you who consider yourself Christ followers, what, if anything, ought we do about that as we engage with people, at work, in our families. One thing I'm noticing is this, it seems to be, and I think it was Bob Fraser who made comments to this effect, and I don't have it in front of me, but the impression I got anyway was that these conversations are coming up sort of whether we like it or not, and there might have been a time where one can sort of leave quote-unquote political or contentious issues aside, but it seems to be pervading our discourse and our whole society, that perhaps it's no longer tenable to remain silent, but perhaps we have to engage. Or maybe you think we do need to remain silent. I'm curious to hear what you have to say in any of those respects. In terms of comments, let me know what you think about this, about any of the things I've discussed. If there's certain topics you want me to try to tackle, I'm open to giving it a shot. If you're curious about what I think about certain things, put that in the comments too. I'm always looking for new ideas to make videos. And I appreciate those of you who take the time to watch and to leave comments. So thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks.